This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey there, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 161 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Helping families feel involved in their children's education goes beyond checking the boxes to make sure you're following legal guidelines. That's why I invited Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell to De Facto Leaders to talk about how school teams can make the IEP process more welcoming to families, especially those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell is a veteran special educator with over 20 years in the field. She has served in various roles from paraeducator to director of student services and special education. She was a classroom teacher for 10 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, working with students from kindergarten through 8th grade. She is a systems-focused educator working at the district level with school teams to ensure that students with disabilities are provided high-quality research-based instruction and that all students are treated with dignity and respect in the least restrictive environment. In addition, she has supported new site leaders in deepening their understanding of special education, including laws and protections for students and families. Kristin is a practitioner researcher working with families to share their experiences and perspectives. Informed with this familial knowledge, teams can make practical shifts needed to move to a collaborative partnership with culturally affirming, sustainable, and equitable families. She has presented at the American Educational Research Association, the National Association of Multicultural Education, and the Association of California School Administrators, among others. Her articles have appeared in the Leadership ACSA magazine, the Journal of Leadership, Equity, and Research, and the KQED Education blog. Her book, Partnering with Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Families in Special Education, was published in December 2023 by Rowman and Littlefield. In this conversation, we discuss a number of topics, including things like when you've provided the procedural safeguards, but aren't really sure if families really understand their rights. What's going on when parents don't show up for parent-teacher conferences and IEP meetings? Why environmental setup matters during meetings, including seating arrangements and how and when the team enters the room. Navigating language barriers, transportation issues, and logistical constraints. Finding the balance between family schedules and staff contractual time when setting up IEP meetings. And we also talk about tips for managing nerves during IEP meetings so you can make your report feel conversational and less technical, so you can actually connect with the people in the room. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out other episodes of De Facto Leaders with other interviews where I had conversations with experts on how to improve community and family engagement, including episode 113, Making Literacy Accessible and Equitable with Cassandra Williams, episode 118, Coaching Aspiring Leaders in School Turnaround and Community Outreach with Edward Gordon II, episode 96, Supporting Bilingualism in K-12 Kids with Brianna Wagner, and episode 143, Developing a Cultural Compatibility Mindset with Melanie Evans. Be sure to check the show notes for links to all of these episodes, as well as where you can go to connect with today's guest. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell. Today I am joined by Dr. Kristin Vogel-Campbell, a special ed administrator and teacher. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me, Karen. I'm really glad to share space with you.
Yeah, so I thought we could start off by having you share a little bit about your professional journey. So what kind of work are you doing now and what led up to that?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is my eighth year in kind of district office or central office work, supporting school sites, school leaders, classroom teachers, school psychologists, service providers, and most importantly, parents and families with navigating the IEP process and everything that is entailed with that. So I've held a couple of different roles in that district office position. I've been a program specialist. I was a director for 1 year. Currently, I am a coordinator of special education. Before that, I was a classroom teacher for 12 years in special education settings. So, our terminology in California, I think, is a little bit different than in other states.
Mm-hmm.
So, I worked primarily from kindergarten through eighth grade in both resource or learning centers as well as special day classes or self-contained classrooms. And my journey into education and special education in particular is a personal one. I was kind of inspired to go and get my master's in special education after my nephew was diagnosed with autism shortly after I finished my undergrad in a completely unrelated field.
Funny how
And
that
hadn't
happens.
Yeah, exactly. So my
Uh-huh.
undergrad is in cultural anthropology,
Okay.
and I wanted to be Indiana Jones when I was growing up. Um, Needing to know at least four or five languages to go into a graduate program, it's not a skill set that I have. So I was kind of in the okay, what to do now type of thing.
Yeah.
And I was gravitated towards education and also social work. Um, but I ultimately decided to pursue education and special education in general because of what I witnessed my brother and his then wife experiencing going
Mm-hmm.
through the medical diagnosis piece as well as the IEP piece when he was in kindergarten.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, social work and education, there are a lot of intersections.
Yeah.
So, um, there's definitely, I've always been drawn to helper professions. So that
Mm-hmm.
was, oh gosh, like 20 years ago at this point, in New
Mm-hmm.
York. After I finished my master's degree, I moved out to California and I've been in special education ever since.
Yeah. So your comment about social work, I have a random question that popped into my head as you were
Yeah.
saying that. So obviously in Illinois, we are under different guidelines than you are in California. There's always those differences from state to state. I talk to people from the East Coast and they tell me different things compared to what's going on in the Midwest. And then, as I've shared before, my sister's a school counselor in
Mhm.
California in your area. And
Yeah.
sometimes I'll talk to people and I'll call her and be like, what exactly is going on over there? Like it sounds different from what I'm experiencing here. So with the social work question, just because I do a lot of work with the related service providers, the SLPs, social workers, psychologists, counselors, other therapists who come in to the picture with special ed, how does social work versus counseling look in the schools in your area? Because I know when I was in the schools, the social worker was often seeing kids. They were sometimes going into the classrooms. They were involved a lot with if there were behavioral issues and they were putting interventions in place. And my sister does a lot of that as a school counselor out in California. And I've talked to people before that said, oh, in social work, it's usually more clinical. And I don't know if that's
Mhm.
true. Has that been your experience?
I think I think in the past and even in the recent past, there has been a definite difference between the two.
Yeah.
But over the past couple of years, especially as California is really focusing on the community schools movement,
Mm-hmm.
it's been a little bit of a blur. So
Yeah.
when I first started, teaching and working in schools, there were school counselors at the elementary level. It was more just guidance and kind of that like tier one support of,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
checking in with a kid. And
Yep.
then at the middle school level, counselors shift to more of, academic counselors. So making sure you turn
Mm-hmm.
your work in on time,
Right.
grades and everything. And social workers would come in from the outside if
Yes, that's what I
families
heard.
were, yeah. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but over the past 3 years, our district in particular, the one that I work in right now, we have hired social workers and mental health clinicians to
Mm-hmm.
start working and embedding their practice in schools.
Mm-hmm.
So tying in that community schools movement, but I think it's also a response to just the increased awareness of mental health, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not just academics, that there's so many other pieces to making sure that a student is successful. So, answering your question but not answering your question,
Yeah.
it's
No, I
evolving,
just
and I'm really curious to see what it looks like in a couple of years from now too.
Yeah. And I definitely plan on having more conversations with people from different parts of the country, different roles to just tease all of that out because I have heard that in the past that social work was more of, again, they're more outside of the schools and it's not necessarily someone who's a school employee or even contracted through the schools. But even when I see the different therapies, so looking at speech pathology, for example, which is my discipline, there are even some differences with the eligibility process as far as are you using cognitive referencing or are you pulling lots of different data and pulling a nice portfolio together and looking at like work samples and doing observations and doing stakeholder interviews. And I do see that starting to happen in Illinois just because we've got a robust system of support, like with MTSS systems and things like that. But so I thought that was really interesting in your book. There were a couple situations where they were looking at reading and dyslexia, and again, I know that I have a couple colleagues out in California who are looking at that and looking at how are we determining which students are eligible and are we using just the formal norm reference tests? And this would be relevant for psychology as well, because they're a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times they're the ones that are evaluating students for specific learning disability. And then the speech pathologist has to come in and identify if there's a language impairment. And then if the district is wanting you to use cognitive referencing, that causes all kinds of problems with identifying and making sure that the right services are in place. So again, another
Yeah,
side tangent that we could go on, but yeah,
absolutely.
I was
I could go on
reminded.
for a really long
I
time.
know I was thinking of all these things as I was looking at the different scenarios you brought up because I was thinking, oh wow, this is related to, you know, what's going on over here at the policy level. And um, yeah, I think these are all factors in the schools being able to pull together a nice comprehensive system for the families. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Um, all right. So one thing, as we're talking about what do the schools have available? How is this experience for families? Yeah, I'd love for you to just kind of share generally what inspired you to focus on that because does seem like it's something that's really central to your work, and then maybe we can go into some specific themes.
Yeah. So I think that my passion in working with families and helping them unpack all of the complicated things that are involved in special education and
Yeah.
policy and procedures, that really kind of came to the forefront of my practice when I was working in the middle school setting. So this
Mm-hmm.
is maybe about 10, 12 years ago. And working with the families who a lot of them don't speak English in the home, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
coming undocumented. Some of them are unhoused, students that are foster youth, and just seeing how the by the time students get to middle school, there's just this unsaid, unspoken thing with teachers that, well, parents have heard all this before. We don't need to be as super thorough. Like, oh, well, our IEP meetings can be shorter because they've heard everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of took me aback a little bit because, well, our kids change from year to year, and especially middle school is a time where we see all sorts of growth.
Mm-hmm.
So, I started talking to parents as their students were starting middle school. I was a sixth grade resource specialist, and in California, middle school is sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. And our assumptions that parents know were completely incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
I think like school professionals assume a lot of times, and when we assume, like, we leave like very serious gaps in our understanding and in parents' understanding, and procedurally, if we're talking about legality, we're
Mm-hmm.
not providing parents an opportunity to effectively participate. So, that was work that I was doing, as a classroom teacher and as a case manager working with families. Continuing my personal journey in education, I received my administrative credential, transitioned into that district office support role, and then all of my interactions with families turned into, well, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And sometimes we're at the last resort before we go through legal procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm asked to come in and try to repair and to, just kind of make sure that the district is making sure the things are doing things procedurally.
Mm-hmm.
For me, ethically, I also look at it, as a student and a parent advocate point of view. Well, yes, like, my role is protecting the district, but we also have to protect our parents and our students. And that's part of protecting the district.
Yeah.
So I pursued my doctoral degree, and my dissertation really focused on engaging in parent narratives. um, I had the benefit of having really wonderful relationships with a variety of families. And when I let them know that this was work that I was bringing to the next level, they were really excited to participate and engage with me. And that's kind of how my dissertation came to be, and then eventually the book that was published last December. It's not a culmination, because a culmination means you're done.
Yeah.
But I feel like that this is a really good benchmark for me.
Yeah.
That this is something that I'm really proud of. I'm really excited to share. And I want people, teachers, educators, like anyone that's working in schools to, digest it and to really reflect on it.
Yeah. Kind of a maybe a launch pad for what lies ahead of for you.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
A launch pad is definitely more forward thinking.
Yeah.
I like that.
So I was just, again, as I was looking through your work and just thinking about all these different times, I can tell you many scenarios where it got to the point where it was getting to be about legality and compliance. And once you get to
Mhm.
that point when you feel like you need to bring in an attorney, things haven't gone well. And so I can
Right.
always think about, if I would have done that differently, if I would have had conversations differently beforehand, could we have avoided getting to that point? Yes, sometimes it's going to happen, but there's probably a lot of scenarios where we could have mitigated that before we got to the point of having this all these people around this table arguing. So one of the things that comes up a lot that's sort of a basic special ed procedural thing is the procedural safeguards. We have to notify parents of their rights, and the way that this was always done in my district was this huge packet of wordy legal terminology that we would give patient or parents at the beginning of the IEP meeting without any time to actually read through it. And yes, there were times when I knew that I had a relationship with those families and we'd been having ongoing conversations. And I knew that they trusted me and felt comfortable. So I could say, hey, here's this document that do you want a copy of this? And they were fine with it because we knew that we had established that trust. But that's not always the case. A lot of times it's sort of parents are kind of blindsided by it and they don't understand what's in there. So I'd love for you to talk about different scenarios that you have seen come about, just specifically around notifying parents of their rights or educating them and engaging them to make sure that they understand, and then what we can do better around that topic.
Yeah. Um, it's the common practice that you had described is very similar to what I still see in a lot of situations out here in
Yeah.
California. And, you know, there's almost a moment where, in California, our document is 19 pages in English. And
Yeah.
it's like, here are your procedural safeguards. Do you have any questions? And
Yeah.
there are so many
Uh-huh.
moments where you just see a parent's eyes like glaze over. And I'm like, okay, we're 2 minutes into the meeting and they're already overwhelmed.
Yeah.
They're
Uh-huh.
already feeling that power imbalance. And,
Uh-huh.
we've kind of lost right there.
Yeah.
Um, what what I've encouraged my special ed professionals to do is to when we first reach out to parents about, hey, we'd like to have an IEP meeting, or hey, like, your child is due for their 3-year review.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the copy, 2 or 3 weeks prior to the meeting,
Of
if you
the
get a
IEP,
chance.
like the
Of yeah,
IEP and
of the
okay, so
IEP.
all the
Yeah.
stuff.
So
Yeah.
exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
giving them that document a couple of weeks in advance, saying, hey, if you have any questions, please let me know. A lot of times parents will they won't ask questions because
I know.
sometimes they don't feel like they have the agency to do so.
Yeah.
We have a kind of a bullet point cheat sheet of the procedural safeguards in English that we also provide to our families. And it's like, hey, if you don't have the time to look
Mm-hmm.
at this document, like here's kind of the salient points.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing is that our procedural safeguards are written at a high school level. And again, that's assuming that our parents are coming in with the capability of being able to comprehend that document.
Yeah. Because of
Um,
reading proficiency
and
or language.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Hmm.
we translate the document into, and I believe in California we have it in 30 something languages,
Oh, wow.
but that's not completely representative of all of the home languages that our families bring to school.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, for example, that I'm currently working with a family whose home language is Nepalese, from Nepal. We
Okay.
don't have the procedural safeguards in Nepal. So what we need to do is we need to districts, schools need to take stock of all of the home languages and then go through that process of not only like translating it, but making sure that parents understand it. And
Yeah.
that's either having, parent nights or doing a video where there's kind of a going through step by step of what each of those things are.
Mm-hmm.
And we have resources in our county where we have folks who engage in that education work with families,
Yeah.
where they will go through and explain it, but it's still so much information.
Yeah.
So I think just being proactive and proactiveness is kind of like the number one piece that I tell all of the folks that I work with, being proactive about sending documentation, asking, not assuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the challenge with saying, let me know if you have any questions.
Yep,
If you are overwhelmed, that's assuming that I can go through and ask specific questions and know what to ask. You
yep,
are assuming that that person has some foundational knowledge of what they're looking at to be able to ask a question and to be able to ask a good question so they can get clarification of what they need. When you're thinking about reading comprehension, you have to know the context of what you're reading to know
Yes.
what's going on. So if
Yeah.
parents don't have that, and then there's a lot of cultural implications too, where education works differently in different countries. So
Yeah. I was just going to point to that we're also assuming that families hold the same cultural norms and values that
yeah.
we do,
Mm-hmm.
where, families that come from another culture may feel like they don't have the right to question or challenge or ask questions of educators.
Mm-hmm.
And when a parent says, no, I don't have any questions, no, everything you're saying is fine, there's also the white educators sometimes take that in and go, well, they're not probing me, they don't really care. And then
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole nother topic that
Yeah.
really is just incredibly frustrating with mindset challenges.
Yeah. So on that topic, I know that there's this, again, the assumption of how they're acting and how you're showing that you are engaged in your child's life and their education. Like I can think of a time that one of my mentors was sharing an example of just getting good attendance at parent teacher conferences, and a
Mm-hmm.
district that she was working with, they just like this teacher could not get parents to show up. And this school in
Mm-hmm.
general was having a really hard time getting parents to engage with their, or in their perception, they were having a difficult time getting parents to engage in their child's education. But all of the things that they were inviting them to were very academic. Here, we're going to go through your grades,
Mm-hmm.
those types of conversations, which you don't know what kind of experience parents have had with the very specific academic stuff. And so, what they ended up doing is that they did some kind of a fundraiser that was at the school that wasn't quite as academic focused, but it was still the school community. And I don't know if it was like the kids put on some kind of performance, and it was like, a packed house, and all of these parents that
Mm-hmm.
never typically showed up for the parent teacher conferences, they got them in the building. And so it was just kind of about engaging them in a different way, and
Mm-hmm.
like giving them another opportunity to participate. So I am curious if you've ever witnessed things like that where we're expecting them to engage in this way, but then they are used to doing it another way. And is there a way we can kind of get everybody in the room together so we can maybe start breaking down some of the barriers there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the number one thing that comes to mind with that is understanding and recognizing, just the power of like generational families. Um,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
and seeing an auntie or a grandparent or an older sister willing and wanting to come and engage with families, if a parent is sending them like as their proxy, like that is that's who's showing up.
Yeah.
And being open to that and not just holding to, well, it needs to either be mom or dad,
Mm-hmm.
when maybe mom or dad are working until 10, 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just dad, maybe it's just mom. So just kind of expanding our understanding of what family is and who who shows up.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's definitely one piece. Um, yeah, making it honoring, in addition to like kind of honoring like the family structure,
Yeah.
making those cultural events like you were talking about, where it's bringing in like the students or the family's cultural wealth. So if it is a cultural presentation, or if students are getting to perform something that they
Mm-hmm.
feel super connected to,
Mm-hmm.
I think is really really important. But yeah, just realizing that our view and our perception is not the only way.
Yeah.
And um, just one little example that's kind of like a um, a side note, is expecting families to, or even students, expecting them to make eye contact
Oh yeah,
and
that's a big
viewing
one.
viewing eye contact as a sign of engagement.
Yeah.
Very much like, not feeling the agency to challenge or question a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some of our families like don't make eye contact, but they are listening and responding
Mm-hmm.
and, putting our biases aside. I think it's like it's not personal. And
Yeah.
I think it's very easy to get down that road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the eye contact one is big just because when you're thinking about students who are not neurotypical or you're thinking about different
Mhm.
cultures where eye contact is seen differently than it is in Western cultures. So that is definitely something that has come up. And, I've even said that yeah, sometimes with students where we get so worried that they're not looking at us. And yeah, it's might be relevant to tell them that sometimes people might expect you to look at them, but that's not the only way that you can show that you're listening and paying attention.
Yeah.
You can maybe just let people know, like, hey, it actually helps me focus more if I'm, doing something else, or, and I've even mentioned that to students because I know that they're going to be put in situations where people are expecting it, and they do need to understand that might not be an accurate or a reasonable thing for the other person to expect, give it,
Mhm.
with whatever the situation is, but they need to know how to advocate for themselves. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
I think, it's with understanding the norms of where you're going into. I think part of it is about, yes, it's relevant to understand what might be expected, but you can still help people to know how to advocate for themselves so that they feel like they feel comfortable in that
Yeah.
situation. I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers guide their teams in supporting students' executive functioning across the day. When it comes to executive functioning and cognitive skills, you can make a big impact in your direct intervention, but you can only go so far if you don't engage other team members, including the other people on your multidisciplinary team, as well as the families. When kids leave your therapy room or your classroom, you need to know that others are going to know how to support them and put the right scaffolds in place with whatever they're doing, whether it be in a classroom or whether it be in the home environment. That's why in the School of Clinical Leadership, I don't just give you a plan for direct therapy, but I also help you lead change management on your team and get everyone working together. And the great part is that if you have a strategic plan for making this happen, you can make a change no matter your job title, even if you're not in an official leadership position on your team. To learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now let's get back to the interview. We've talked a lot about, okay, here's ways that we can start building that relationship. But then when we're talking about the actual IEP meeting, because I know this causes so much anxiety for all of the parties, the people who are
Mhm.
running the IEP meetings, the parents who are attending them, everybody. I know that when I was definitely my first couple of years, it gets hard because you know that you're supposed to be engaged during the meeting, but then you know that you have to present your report and you're trying to focus on what am I going to say, but also I want to pay attention to the people in front of me. And I just remember being kind of like fidgeting with my papers and
Yeah.
sweating and all of that, and worrying, am I going to come across like I'm not really engaged in this meeting? So how do you recommend that teachers, therapists, anybody running an IEP meeting handle their own nerves about compliance and all of the things, but still make families
Yeah.
feel good about being there?
Yeah. this is kind of the power of the multidisciplinary school team
Yeah.
and making sure that you can rely on your other team members
Yeah.
to step in and take on some of those facilitation roles while you're
Mm-hmm.
in the part of presenting your assessment.
Mm.
Um, and it comes with time and it comes with experience and it comes with sometimes making little flubs and reflecting on them later.
Mm-hmm.
I know when I first started, I was super nervous and I would read verbatim from the report.
Yeah.
Yeah, which, I
Me
understand
too. Totally.
for sure. I have been
Yeah.
there. But in talking with some families, and we talk about this in
Yeah.
the book, like
Uh-huh.
parents see that and they're like, well, if they truly knew my child, they wouldn't have to read from the paper. They could just summarize it for me.
Right.
So I think there's definitely an understanding that when we're presenting an assessment report or even talking about like progress, we don't have to, we can take a step back and be a little bit more informal in our delivery. Like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
like here are some work samples. Like this is what your child is doing with, being able to like cross the midline or like in their speech assessment or
Mm-hmm.
in their writing sample. Samples that, parents can see
Mm-hmm.
are super, super powerful and it helps them make that connection. And it also takes some of the explaining and the wordiness out of um, the delivery of our assessment reports.
Yeah.
So I think visuals are super powerful and, pausing and like, checking around the room, not just with parents, but with your colleagues. Sometimes a colleague will want to, if they see something, they'll step in and they're like, yeah, and this applies to when they're in the classroom. I'm also seeing this. So it's not just you being, on the stage with the spotlight underneath you. I think
Mm-hmm.
making sure that um, whatever skills you're talking about also, you know, ensuring that like they're generalized to the greatest extent possible with the other service providers.
Mm-hmm. I love that
And
example
yeah,
with pulling your
yeah,
colleagues in.
yeah. And also, hoping that you have a knowledgeable and supportive administrator in the meeting.
Yeah.
Because the administrator, and in California we refer to them as the LEA,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or the chair of the
Mm-hmm.
meeting. They're the ones that are ultimately responsible. So, some of that responsibility should fall on them. But as we know, not a lot of admin have that special ed experience. They're just, going through the motions. And
Yeah.
I get it. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is a very intimidating experience, especially when you have advocates or attorneys.
Yeah.
And if
That
and if you
is
are
really
yeah,
nerve-wracking. Yeah.
if you're nervous about speaking in front of groups, like, again, like turn to your colleagues and ask if you can run through
Mm-hmm.
and, see if they can role play with you about that to kind of gain your confidence.
I love that example of practicing, because if you're used to talking about something, it frees up more mental bandwidth to be able to pay attention to what's going on around you. So, I can think of the example of the first time I ever had to be the one to tell a parent that their child had a disability, and I'm reading my report, and it was the psychologist and the social worker who were in the room with me that sort of bailed me out, because I was sitting there nervously reading my report, and every time I kept saying the word delay, because sometimes when I'm nervous I'll repeat
Mm-hmm.
myself, and then the mom was flinching every time I said that word, and I
Yeah.
didn't even notice it, and the psychologist kind of jumped in because she was, again, more experienced and kind of jumped
Yeah.
into that mentorship role. And sometimes we didn't always have the principal wasn't always the LEA, or an administrator wasn't the LEA. It was somebody else, depending on the situation. But that was huge, just having those relationships. And I do like the idea of practicing because, yeah, there are times when if I was, got used to presenting certain information, then I could actually sit there and have a conversation with the parent because I've gone through it a bunch of times. So that's definitely good advice, just the practice, because practice is what helps you to feel solid in what you're bringing forward.
Right.
Yeah, so have you ever when you're just thinking about the physical environment of a meeting, what kinds of things have you seen come up there and how can we be aware of the space in classrooms and in meetings? Because I know that's
Yeah.
something that when you're able to maneuver around easily or where you're used to a room being set up a certain way with emphasis being placed on a certain person, um, I can imagine some things might come up that might feel intimidating or not welcoming.
Yeah. Immediately when I think about physical space is making sure that everyone in the meeting is able to see the other person.
Yeah.
When we have an IEP meeting in a classroom, and sometimes we have to put 3 or 4 desks together, we have this like wide like rectangle, and
Uh-huh.
folks in the corner like get kind of lost in that pocket.
Yeah.
So what I've been working with some site leaders is if they have a designated conference room area, working towards like having circular tables,
Mm-hmm.
so that everyone in a circle is visible, or even having a table that if you need to add another piece to make it wider. Those are things that come with financial implications, and not every site leader is able to do that.
Yeah.
But there are really, really simple things of at the beginning of an IEP meeting, how many times is the parent walking in and all of the school team members are already sitting down
Oh, yeah.
and they don't have a choice as to where they sit,
Mm-hmm.
or most of the school team members are sitting on one side of the table and
Mm-hmm.
the parents and maybe their advocate or their outside social worker sit on the other side of the table. Like
Mm-hmm.
way like that is just such a clear example of like us versus them. And
Yeah.
that doesn't lead to
Physically.
yeah, physically it doesn't lead to
Yeah.
productive meetings because you already have someone coming in going, okay, I guess that's where I'm going to sit.
Mm-hmm.
So some teams now are in the practice of everyone walking in to the meeting space at the same time, giving the
Yeah.
families first choice where they want to sit.
Mm-hmm.
Some parents may want a wall behind them. Some parents may want to sit closer to the door if they need to like step out if it's too emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Some parents would rather sit in kind of the center area, but
Yeah.
giving them that option and that flexibility is super super important, and leveling the playing field by not looking as if we've already been meeting before you show up.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
happens a lot where you don't even think
a
about it.
lot.
Everybody's already in their chairs and then they walk in and everyone's staring at them.
Yep,
It's so intimidating.
exactly,
I mean, and
exactly.
it's just one of those things that you wouldn't think of. And I think I've even heard the recommendation of one, like you said, everybody walking in together. And just every
Mhm.
time even if you have a full day of IEP meetings and you're going one after another, get up and at least if you're in the room, have everybody kind of standing up and mingling in another place and then come over here
Exactly.
together instead of just it's like you're coming into a courtroom or something.
Yes. Yeah. And there are other like tiny like physical things that can be done to make a meeting space more inviting. I think
Hmm.
of one of my principals who she has like a Brita filter pitcher and like glasses of water so that you can have a drink of water during the meeting. And,
Hmm.
having a box of tissues. Like we're not expecting parents to get very emotional, but it's a gesture that we
Hmm.
can offer, because I've also seen so many parents cry and then they have to like wipe their face with their sleeve or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we're also talking about parents who, like, we require interpretation for the meeting, making
Yeah.
sure that the parent is able to sit next to the interpreter. Um, and we can talk about interpretation for a very, very long time, but
Oh, I know. I have a thing that I pulled out here a
yeah,
bit that I wanted.
yeah.
The
um
having a student interpret for their own IEP meeting.
whew,
Uh,
right.
yeah. I can't even
Yeah.
believe that
Well,
that's
I mean,
happening. Unless they're
it
so I know that sometimes you want the student to present and that we start to do
exactly.
that. Totally different situation versus being like, well, we didn't get an interpreter and you're responsible for communicating. Completely
Right.
different scenario.
That is not how I want to acknowledge a student's linguistic capital,
Yeah.
because if teachers are relying on a child to interpret, they're going to put up their filters and they're not going to convey all of the information in a way
Hmm.
that can and should be conveyed with adults. Like,
Hmm.
I've seen, you know, teachers kind of like sugarcoat that, where, well, you can do a better job at reading or paying attention, when it's a much deeper problem.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I have not heard of a student interpreting, at least in my district, in several years, which is great, because
Hmm.
procedurally that is a big no-no, but also ethically, just
Yeah.
it feels really like icky.
But that, I mean,
That
it's
that's the
happened
technical
before,
term.
right?
It has happened
Yeah.
before. And you know what? And it's okay with going, hey, you know what? We don't have an interpreter. We're going to have to find another time.
Yeah.
And obviously apologizing to the parent, because
Yeah.
sometimes they're taking off work, but
Yeah.
I don't want to put a student in that position.
No.
That's not their job or their responsibility at all.
Yeah. I think there's times when technically you're within your legal parameters. You're compliant. I mean, that's something that where it's clearly that shouldn't be happening. But then there's these other things where no, you're not breaking any rules by having everybody sitting in their chairs already, but you're certainly not helping facilitate, the relationship between the parents if you do it that way.
Right.
So
Right.
a lot of these
Absolutely.
things that are not you're not technically doing anything wrong per se in big air quotes, but it's probably not super helpful either. Um,
Yeah.
so let me think. I'm trying to think of all the different, I would love to talk about some of the logistical things. And again, I know there's logistics, but then there's the experience that you're creating for parents around things like
Hmm.
scheduling and transportation, because I know that can be a big factor for people that they need to physically be able to get to school, or if they're working two jobs, then they need
Yeah.
to have a certain length of time to coordinate logistically for meetings or yeah, just those kinds of things that come up that maybe we wouldn't think about if it wasn't our experience growing up.
Yeah. So I think, just parents have always had the um, option of participating through like teleconference,
Yeah.
like calling into a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Which it's not great and it's not ideal, but if that is the only option for families, like, we have been able to have very productive meetings like
Mm-hmm.
that. I think, video conferencing, so either like Zoom or Google Meet, like, it does open up a lot of possibilities for a lot of families.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are some families that actually prefer to meet over um, video conferencing,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
for one reason or another. I know that, we have a lot of families who do work, an hour and a half away. And that would require them to take the entire day off of work to go to the physical school, whereas they just have to block off some time on their calendar. Um, for families that, I really stress that, our families who we bring an interpreter for, I would absolutely prefer to meet with them in person if at all
Mm-hmm.
possible,
Yeah.
because interpretation over video conferencing is really, really tricky. It's just one more thing that we don't have control over. If the interpreter's connection is shaky,
Mm-hmm.
we're not ensuring parent participation. There's the delay in the interpreter uh, speaking to the parent responding. Um, so we have been able to like provide like transportation vouchers to parents
Mm-hmm.
who, need that to get to school.
Mm-hmm.
So they can take like a Lyft or a car service.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, all of our schools are like relatively close to public transportation. So there's that. And then just, being as flexible as possible with timing of meetings.
Yeah.
Um, if a parent works an overnight shift, and they're getting out of work at 7 o'clock, they may want the early morning meeting on the way home from work so then they can go home and go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Or they may want the late afternoon meeting so then they can go to work afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think it's what I've seen in practice a lot of times is teams making kind of like a master IEP calendar at the beginning of the year
Yeah.
and giving each uh, annual or 3-year review like their designated like time slot. But that's not the be all end all. We have to make sure that that works for families as well.
Yeah. I have
Yeah.
seen that some districts will do that at the beginning just because they're like, here's the day you're going to get lots of time in advance. And it's not,
Yeah,
yes, if a family says, I can't make it at that time, it gives ample time to work around that.
absolutely.
How do you, when you're thinking about the district staff and contractual time versus
Hmm.
being flexible with parent schedules, how do you find the balance between those types of things?
That's really difficult to navigate
Yeah,
because as an administrator, I have to honor and respect our teacher contract and our service provider contract.
yeah,
Just in particular, like in where I'm working right now, there is not a lot of flexibility for having meetings outside of a contracted day where
yeah,
we would have to ask them and then of course obviously pay them on a time card, but a lot of our teachers and service providers also have families and little ones that they need to get to.
yeah,
um, so I think in the rare circumstance where it does happen, if we give our folks enough ample time to find alternative childcare or arrangements, we're able to make that happen. But we're very restricted in the times that we can by default offer for meetings. And
yeah,
that's not the case everywhere. I've had uh, I've worked in places where I've had IEP meetings at 4 or 4:30, um, and it's difficult for teachers and for all of the school staff. Um, but if that's the time that the parents can make it, there has to be a little bit of negotiation on both sides.
yeah. I agree with that. And I think that
Yeah,
giving people ample time, it's important all around for everybody.
yeah.
And when I was working around those types of things, the advance notice was really important. And also
Hmm.
I think just the boundaries for everyone too. Like if you are asking your staff to do that constantly, that's going to be an issue. But if you're saying, okay, like we're staying within our contracted time as much as possible. And yes, there's some really unique circumstance. We're going to ask you way in advance. We're going to make sure you're compensated. Then I think that's a little different. Like I would always, if I knew it was something that wasn't going to happen constantly and I wasn't going to always be asked to go to meetings at 5 p.m. at the last minute, I would feel very
Right.
different as a person on that staff. And that's kind of how it was handled in my
Yeah,
situation.
yeah.
So
Very, very similar.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what other things, I know we've kind of gone in a bunch of different directions, but what other things have come up for you that we haven't talked about yet that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah. Wow. I think you touched on it a little bit where um, making sure, we as, school employees, district employees, we have to make sure that we are in compliance, that,
Hmm.
and I'm air quoting, so we're
Yeah.
checking the box, that we are
Right.
doing everything procedurally that we have to do. But understanding that in a lot of circumstances, we need to go beyond that.
Yeah.
And it's asking a lot of staff, to make sure that we're inviting and including parents. But you know, parent legally, school districts and IEP teams at the school level don't need to send draft copies home
Hmm.
prior to the meeting, which
Yeah.
I kind of find astounding
I think it's
because
different in different places because it was like it
I
wasn't
would
legally
I would hope
required.
so.
Yeah,
I
like
would hope so.
and sometimes a district or a state will say, like, we'll put it in their policy, even if it's not federal, and or the district will say,
Yes.
this is our policy, even though it's not in your this, it's not statute, it's a rule. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
ways.
it should absolutely, when IDEA is reauthorized sometime in the future, like I feel like there should be an extended piece on parent engagement in
Hmm.
the IEP process. I would love for that to be part of IDEA so that there's no wiggle room there.
Hmm.
And including like things translated prior to the meeting.
Yeah.
Because again, like our
Oh
Spanish
yeah.
speaking families or our families who speak Tagalog, one of the native languages of the Philippines,
Oh yeah.
if we're presenting them information in English and they don't speak or read English, like that's it's not giving them the opportunity to do that. So I think it's,
Yeah.
there's best practices, but we need to move on to kind of like better practices, that doing more than the bare minimum is absolutely necessary. And the families that I talk with in the book, and even, outside of that, they all stress like they understand all of the stressors that teachers and service providers are under. But at the end of the day, they have one IEP meeting a year. We have, 30, 40, however many we have
Yeah,
and interact
lots.
with.
Uh-huh.
So, I think it's really essential for us to look at the family perspective and go, like, sometimes this is their one opportunity to get updates about their child.
Hmm.
So we need
Yeah.
to recognize the severity of that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy how fast the year goes by and you think, I feel like I just talked to this parent a month ago, but it's been a year, you know?
Right. Yeah.
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 And there's many things where it's people issues versus system issues where if you have a huge caseload, it makes it hard for you to do those things. And I think that we're
Yeah.
acknowledging that is, as we're having this conversation, we're also acknowledging that nobody goes into special ed to do the bare minimum, even if that's what's the legal, that's what's legally
Yeah.
required. Everyone would love to be able to go above and beyond. It's just constantly what I hear from people. And so I think we're acknowledging that as we're having this conversation.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
we are all
Yeah.
human. We're
Yeah.
not, programmed AI.
Yeah.
And just, I think also, for teachers and for school psychs and SLPs, like to continue to be like gentle with yourself. And
Mm,
if a meeting doesn't go the way that you anticipated, you know, take some time and then look on it and reflect and go, okay, what were the things that I had no control over?
hmm.
What were some of the things that I did have control over? Like, so how can I change the experience for everyone next time?
Yeah.
And, even, 20 years into special education, like there are meetings where afterwards I'm like, okay, like I know exactly like where I slipped up and what I can do differently.
Hmm.
And reaching out to a parent, like this happened 2 weeks ago, where I misspoke and the parents did not react well. And, afterwards, I had to take some time, but I sent an email and I said, hey, I'm like, I want to take responsibility for, you know, uh, what I heard, I saw that what I said had an impact on you. And that was not my intention. You know, if you would like to check in about it, like I am absolutely like more than happy, please give me some feedback so that the next time we meet, it can be productive for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But this is
Yeah.
also like year 20 coming in. Like I don't expect our new teachers to uh have that bandwidth.
Yeah.
um the power of mentoring, like you had said before, like
Yeah.
our mentors, like supporting our new staff and making sure that they get to a point where someday they are able to reflect and respond like that.
Yeah. Well, I think you've given a lot of good suggestions that despite the fact that we have big caseloads, just little things that don't take that much time and effort
Mhm.
can make a big difference, like the arrangement of a room. That's not going to take you that much more time if you just decide, you know what, we're going to get up and move around in between the meetings and change the way that we position the room. That's not a lot of extra prep typically once it's done. Or I'm going
Right.
to make sure that I have regular meetings with my coworkers because then we can reflect on what happened together. We can practice what we're doing. We can get feedback from each other. We can share what we might be nervous about. So you could probably tick off a bunch of those boxes that we said with one meeting if you are thinking about all the different things that can come up. So, yeah.
Mhm.
So where can people go to learn more about you, to connect with you and learn about your work?
Yeah. So I'm active on LinkedIn, and absolutely, would love to connect with educators and even families there. My website is under construction, so I don't have a website per se. But yeah, LinkedIn, my like academic articles are on Google Scholar.
Okay.
And then more just like social/academic things. I have an Instagram, so there are some like book and educated related pieces there, but it's also uh, you know, love of books, uh, social things in San Francisco, and you know, it's always good to kind of like uh, pull aside the curtain and
Uh-huh.
see someone
Yeah.
who is super invested, but also having that like work life balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
See a little bit of
absolutely,
you.
you exactly. There's a
Uh-huh.
lot of me, but yeah. So I'm absolutely like um open to connecting with like-minded folks on any of those channels.
Great. Well, yeah, and we can link to all of your resources in the show notes.
Yeah,
So thank you so much for
absolutely.
being here with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with Dr. Vogel-Campbell, as well as the other episodes on De Facto Leaders, where I talk about how to improve community and family engagement, including episode 113, Making Literacy Accessible and Equitable with Cassandra Williams, episode 118, Coaching Aspiring Leaders in School Turnaround and Community Outreach with Edward Gordon II, episode 96, Supporting Bilingualism in K-12 Kids with Brianna Wagner, and episode 143, Developing a Cultural Compatibility Mindset with Melanie Evans. Again, as I mentioned, all of those will be linked in the show notes, as well as where you can go to connect with Kristin on LinkedIn and where you can go to check out her book, Partnering with Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Families in Special Education. Finally, if you want a system and a plan for putting executive functioning support in place on your school team, if you know that students need more support and you know that it goes beyond what you can do in direct therapy and you need to get your whole team on board, then check out the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about the program, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As always, it helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you have a suggestion for a guest or you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, feel free to email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time.